nothing but a minimum wage loser," Bradley Morrison sneered, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor of the executive conference room. "Face it, Alice. Some people are born to lead, and others—" He gestured dismissively at my worn Target blazer and scuffed flats. "Others are born to serve coffee and file paperwork. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." The boardroom erupted in polite chuckles from the other executives. Patricia Hawkins, the HR director, didn't even look up from her manicured nails. Thomas Chen, the operations manager, shook his head with that familiar expression of pity I'd grown to hate. And there I was, Alice Reynolds, 26 years old, holding a stack of proposals that would never see the light of day, watching my dreams crumble in real time. But here's what they didn't know. That minimum wage loser they were laughing at, she was about to become their boss, and the company they thought was untouchable? It was about to be mine. The morning started like any other at Morrison & Associates Marketing. I arrived at 6:30 a.m., a full hour before anyone else, clutching my gas station coffee and yesterday's leftover sandwich. The security guard, Miguel, gave me his usual nod. At least someone in this building treated me like a human being. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual, maybe because I knew what was waiting for me. Morrison & Associates occupied the top 3 floors of the glass tower in downtown Chicago. Bradley Morrison had inherited the company from his father, along with the corner office, the mahogany desk, and the belief that success was a birthright rather than something earned. I'd been working there for 3 years, starting as a receptionist and clawing my way up to junior marketing coordinator. The pay was barely enough to cover my studio apartment rent and ramen noodle dinners, but I had bigger plans. Those plans were currently sitting in my desk drawer, printed on cheap paper, because I couldn't afford the good stuff. Market analysis reports, campaign strategies, client retention programs, all written during my lunch breaks and late nights after everyone else had gone home. I'd been preparing for this moment for months, the quarterly review meeting, where Bradley would finally see what I was capable of. The office was starting to fill up as I made my way to my cubicle. Jennifer Walsh, the senior account manager, swept past me in her designer coat, her heels announcing her arrival to everyone within 50 feet. She'd been with the company for 8 years and made sure everyone knew it. Her yearly salary was more than I made in 3 years, and she never let me forget it. "Alice, honey," she called out, not bothering to slow down. "The coffee machine in the break room is acting up again. Be a dear and call maintenance, would you?" I wasn't her assistant. I wasn't anyone's assistant. But I nodded anyway, because picking battles over coffee machines wasn't going to get me promoted. I had to save my energy for the real fight. The morning crawled by with mind-numbing tasks: data entry, phone calls, scheduling meetings for people who made 10 times my salary. But every monotonous moment was fuel for what I was planning. I watched Bradley through his glass office walls, taking long lunches, playing golf on his computer, leaving early for, quote, client meetings that everyone knew were just happy hour at the country club. His father, Richard Morrison, had built this company from nothing in the 1980s. He'd started in a basement with 2 employees and a dream. Now it was a multi-million-dollar operation, with offices in 6 cities and a client list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. But Richard was gone, and Bradley was running it into the ground with his combination of arrogance and incompetence. I'd done my research. Revenue was down 18% over the past 2 years. 3 major clients had jumped ship to competitors. The company's Glassdoor reviews were brutal, with former employees citing, quote, toxic management and, quote, lack of growth opportunities. But Bradley lived in his bubble, convinced that his Ivy League MBA and family name made him untouchable. The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. I'd been preparing for weeks, running through my presentation in the mirror of my tiny bathroom, timing every slide, anticipating every question. This was my chance to show them what I could do, to prove that the girl from the cubicle had ideas worth hearing. At 1:45, I gathered my materials and headed to the conference room. The presentation was loaded on my laptop, backup copies on 2 USB drives, and hard copies printed at the FedEx store down the street. I'd even splurged on a new blazer from the clearance rack at Nordstrom Rack, navy blue with silver buttons that made me feel almost professional. The conference room was intimidating. All glass and steel with a view of the Chicago skyline that cost more than most people's houses. Bradley sat at the head of the massive table, his feet up on the polished surface, scrolling through his phone. Patricia Hawkins was reviewing personnel files, probably deciding whose benefits to cut next. Thomas Chen was late, as usual, probably stuck in traffic after another extended lunch. "Alice," Bradley said without looking up, "I thought we were reviewing your performance, not giving you a platform to play CEO." I felt my cheeks burn but kept my voice steady. I prepared a presentation about some initiatives that could help the company grow: market research, client retention strategies, cost-saving measures. "Cost-saving measures?" Patricia laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Honey, we pay you barely above minimum wage. What could you possibly know about managing a budget?" The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector, my hands trembling slightly. The first slide appeared on the screen: growth opportunities for Morrison & Associates. "I've identified several areas where we could increase revenue," I began, my voice gaining strength. "First, our digital marketing presence is practically non-existent. We're losing clients to agencies that offer integrated online campaigns. Second, our pricing structure hasn't been updated in 5 years, meaning we're leaving money on the table. Third, Bradley interrupted, finally looking up from his phone. "You're a minimum wage employee with a community college degree trying to tell Harvard MBAs how to run a business." The words hit like a physical blow. I'd worked 2 jobs to put myself through community college, studying marketing and business while supporting my sick mother. Every class was paid for, with overtime hours and sacrifice. But in Bradley's world, that meant nothing. "I may not have gone to Harvard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I know this industry, I know these clients. I talk to them every day, I see their frustrations, I understand their needs." "What you understand," Thomas Chen said, finally arriving and sliding into his seat, "is how to answer phones and make copies. There's a difference between doing the work and understanding the business." The presentation continued for another 10 minutes, but I could see I'd already lost them. They weren't listening to my market analysis or growth projections. They were seeing a girl in a discount blazer pretending to be something she wasn't. When I finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of Bradley's fingers drumming on the table. "Alice," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd heard 1,000 times, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you need to understand your place in this organization. Your support staff. Your job is to support the people who make the real decisions." "But the ideas are solid," I insisted. The market research shows that you've been spending company time on personal projects," Patricia interjected. "That's a violation of your employment agreement." My heart sank. I'd been so careful, only working on the presentation during my lunch breaks and after hours. But they were twisting it, making it sound like I was stealing from the company. "I want to contribute more," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "I know I can help this company grow, just give me a chance." Bradley stood up, his full height towering over me even from across the table. "You want to know what I think, Alice? I think you're delusional. You think because you read a few business books and put together a PowerPoint presentation, you're ready to run with the big dogs. But this isn't a charity case. This is a business." He walked around the table, his presence filling the room. "You're a nice girl, Alice. But you're minimum wage for a reason. Some people are born to lead, and others." He paused, looking me up and down like I was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "Others are born to serve coffee and file paperwork." The laughter that followed was worse than the words. These people, who I'd worked alongside for 3 years, who I'd covered for when they were hungover, who I'd stayed late to help with their projects, were laughing at me. Not with me, at me. "You're nothing but a minimum wage loser," Bradley continued, his voice growing louder. "Face it, Alice. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." I gathered my materials with shaking hands, my face burning with humiliation. The presentation I'd worked on for weeks, the strategies that could have saved the company millions, were dismissed as the fantasies of a delusional receptionist. As I walked toward the door, I heard Patricia whisper to Thomas, "Poor thing. She actually thought she was management material." The elevator ride down felt like a funeral march. I could feel the tears threatening, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Not here, not in their building, not where they could add it to the story they'd tell at their next happy hour. Miguel, the security guard, gave me a concerned look as I passed his desk. "You okay, Miss Reynolds?" I managed a weak smile. "Just another day at the office, Miguel." But it wasn't just another day. It was the day that changed everything. As I walked out into the Chicago afternoon, past the expensive cars in the executive parking spaces, past the tourists taking pictures of the impressive building, I made a decision that would haunt Bradley Morrison for the rest of his career. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to disappear into the sea of minimum wage workers that Bradley seemed to think was my destiny. I was going to do something that would make that afternoon meeting look like a minor inconvenience. I was going to buy his company. The idea hit me like lightning as I stood on the sidewalk outside Morrison and Associates. It was impossible, of course. I had $347 in my checking account and a credit score that wouldn't qualify me for a store credit card. But impossible had never stopped me before. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I walked to the nearest coffee shop, a small place called Brew and Bean that I'd discovered during my lunch breaks. The owner, Mrs. Chen, always gave me a discount because I was one of the few customers who actually talked to her instead of just grunting their order. I ordered my usual small coffee, no cream, no sugar, and found a corner table where I could think. The humiliation was still fresh, but underneath it was something else: anger. Pure, focused anger at a system that rewarded incompetence as long as it came with the right pedigree. Bradley Morrison was running his father's company into the ground, and everyone knew it. The employees whispered about it in the break room. The clients complained about it in their feedback surveys. The industry trade publications wrote about it in their quarterly reviews. But knowing about the problem and being able to fix it were two different things. I pulled out my phone and started making notes, the same way I'd approached every challenge in my life. Step by step, methodically, with the patience of someone who'd never had anything handed to them. First, I needed to understand exactly how bad Morrison and Associates' financial situation really was. I'd seen the quarterly reports, but those were sanitized versions meant for employee consumption. The real numbers were in the SEC filings, the bank statements, the vendor agreements. I needed to see the whole picture. Second, I needed capital. Not just enough to buy the company, but enough to turn it around. That meant investors, loans, maybe even bringing in partners. It meant convincing people with money that a minimum wage marketing coordinator could run a multi-million-dollar business. Third, I needed a plan. Not just for the acquisition, but for what came after. How to retain the good employees, how to fix the client relationships, how to rebuild the company's reputation. I needed to become the CEO that Bradley Morrison had never been. The coffee shop was filling up with the afternoon crowd, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, calculating possibilities, identifying obstacles, mapping out a path that seemed impossible but felt inevitable. By the time I finished my coffee, I had the skeleton of a plan. It would take time, it would take sacrifice, it would take every ounce of intelligence and determination I possessed. But I was going to do it. I was going to buy Morrison and Associates, and when I did, Bradley Morrison was going to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of that conference room table. The minimum wage loser they'd laughed at was about to become their boss. And when that day came, I was going to remember every single person who had laughed. The rejection letter from First National Bank arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the boardroom humiliation. I stared at the formal letterhead, the polite but firm language explaining why a minimum wage employee with no collateral couldn't secure a business loan. It was the 7th rejection I'd received, but I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash with the same determination I'd shown the previous 6. Banking hours were over, but the real work was just beginning. My studio apartment had been transformed into a makeshift war room. The kitchen table was covered with financial documents, market research, and competitor analysis. The walls were lined with post-it notes mapping out Morrison and Associates' organizational structure, client relationships, and revenue streams. My laptop never seemed to close anymore, its screen glowing late into the night as I dug deeper into the company's vulnerabilities. But tonight was different. Tonight I was putting my real skills to work, the ones that Bradley Morrison and his executive team had never bothered to discover. While they saw me as nothing more than a glorified secretary, I'd been quietly building something that would make their Harvard MBAs look like participation trophies. The encrypted folder on my desktop contained 2 years of work. Not the presentation I'd shown in that conference room, but something far more valuable. A complete digital marketing framework that I'd been developing since my first day at Morrison & Associates. Every failed campaign, every client complaint, every missed opportunity had been carefully documented and analyzed. What I'd discovered was a company bleeding money through inefficiency, outdated strategies, and sheer incompetence. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Sarah Martinez, who worked as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs. "Still up working on your crazy plan?" I smiled as I typed back. "Not crazy, calculated." Sarah was one of the few people who knew the full scope of what I was attempting. We'd met in community college, both of us working multiple jobs to pay for our education. While I'd ended up at Morrison & Associates, she'd managed to land at Goldman through a combination of brilliant grades and relentless networking. She was also the only person who understood why I couldn't just quit and find another job. "You know, I think you're brilliant," she texted back. "But buying a company worth $30 million when you make $30,000 a year might be pushing it, even for you." She had a point. On paper, my plan was insane. But I'd been studying Morrison & Associates like a chess grandmaster studies an opponent, and I'd found something that made the impossible seem inevitable. The company was worth $30 million, but it was also hemorrhaging cash at a rate that would make it worthless within 18 months. I pulled up my secret weapon, a comprehensive analysis of Morrison & Associates' digital footprint. While Bradley and his team focused on traditional advertising methods, the marketing world had shifted online. Their biggest competitor, Zenith Marketing, had increased their revenue by 300% over the past 3 years by embracing digital transformation. Meanwhile, Morrison & Associates was still running newspaper ads and radio spots like it was 1995. The numbers were staggering. Morrison & Associates was spending $2.3 million annually on traditional advertising with an average ROI of 12%. A properly executed digital campaign could achieve the same results for $800,000 with an ROI of 45%. That was nearly $1.5 million in annual savings, not counting the additional revenue from improved client retention and acquisition. But that was just the beginning. I'd been tracking the company's client churn rate, and it was devastating. They were losing an average of one major client every quarter, with exit interviews consistently citing outdated strategies and, quote, lack of innovation. Each departing client represented approximately $400,000 in annual revenue. Do the math. And Morrison & Associates was hemorrhaging $1.6 million per year, simply because they refused to adapt to modern marketing practices. My laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was someone I'd never heard of, David Kim, senior partner at Meridian Capital. The subject line made my heart skip. "Regarding your business proposal." I opened the email with trembling fingers. 3 weeks ago, I sent a cold email to 50 venture capital firms, knowing that 49 would either ignore it or send polite rejection letters. But sometimes, all you need is one person to see the potential that others miss. "Ms. Reynolds," the email began, "your analysis of Morrison & Associates' market position caught our attention. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your acquisition proposal. Are you available Thursday at 2 p.m.? I read the email 3 times before it fully sank in. David Kim wasn't just any venture capitalist. He was known for identifying undervalued companies and turning them into industry leaders. 2 years ago, he'd backed a small tech startup that was now worth $500 million. If he was interested in my proposal, it meant I wasn't as crazy as everyone thought. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday, but I spent the next 2 days preparing like it was the most important presentation of my life. Because it was. I refined my financial projections, updated my market analysis, and created a comprehensive turnaround plan that would make Morrison & Associates profitable within 6 months. The Meridian Capital offices were everything I'd expected: floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art, and the kind of understated luxury that screamed success. David Kim was younger than I'd imagined, maybe early 40s, with the kind of confidence that came from making million-dollar decisions before lunch. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his attention completely focused on me. "I have to admit," he said as we settled into his office, "your proposal was refreshing. Most people come in here with pie-in-the-sky ideas about disrupting industries. You came with actual data." I connected my laptop to his conference room display, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to attempt. Morrison & Associates is a textbook example of a company that's succeeding despite its leadership, not because of it. The presentation I'd prepared was nothing like the one I'd given to Bradley Morrison. This was surgical, precise, and devastating in its analysis. I showed David how Morrison & Associates had consistently underperformed compared to industry standards. I demonstrated how their client retention problems were directly linked to their refusal to embrace digital marketing. I presented a detailed financial model showing how a $5 million investment could turn the company around within 18 months. "You've obviously done your homework," David said when I finished, "but I have to ask the obvious question. Why are you? You're a junior employee at this company. What makes you think you can run it better than the current management?" It was the question I'd been preparing for since the day I'd left that humiliating boardroom meeting. I pulled up my final slide, a side-by-side comparison of my digital marketing framework versus Morrison & Associates' current strategy. "I've been developing this system for 2 years," I said, my voice gaining strength. "Not as a side project, but as a complete reimagining of how marketing should work in the modern economy." While Bradley Morrison was playing golf and taking long lunches, I was studying every successful marketing campaign of the past decade. I identified patterns, developed algorithms, and created a framework that could revolutionize how companies approach client acquisition and retention. David leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Show me." I switched to a live demonstration, pulling up a mock campaign I'd created for a fictional client. Within minutes, I'd outlined a comprehensive digital strategy that included social media integration, search engine optimization, content marketing, and data analytics. The projected ROI was 340% over 12 months. "This is impressive," David said, scrolling through the detailed projections. "But theory is one thing, practice is another. Have you actually tested this framework?" I smiled, knowing I was about to play my ace. "I have. 3 months ago, I reached out to Martinez Construction, a small local company that had been struggling with their marketing. They were spending $15,000 a month on traditional advertising with minimal results. I offered to revamp their entire strategy for free, just to test my framework." I pulled up Martinez Construction's before and after metrics. In 3 months, their online presence had increased by 450%. Their lead generation had improved by 280%. Most importantly, their revenue had increased by $200,000, all while reducing their advertising spend by 40%. The owner, Roberto Martinez, was so impressed that he offered me a full-time position as his marketing director, I continued. I turned it down because I had bigger plans, but he agreed to provide a reference for anyone who wanted to verify the results. David was quiet for a long moment, studying the data on his screen. Finally, he looked up with the kind of expression that venture capitalists got when they smelled a winning investment. "Alice," he said, "I'm going to ask you a very serious question, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you prepared to commit the next 5 years of your life to this venture? Because if we move forward, there's no going back. You'll be betting everything on your ability to outperform people who've been in this industry longer than you've been alive." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I thought about my studio apartment, my gas station coffee, the way Patricia Hawkins had laughed at my presentation. I thought about Bradley Morrison's sneer, his certainty that some people were born to lead, while others were born to follow. "Mr. Kim," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, I've been preparing for this my entire life. I'm ready. He nodded slowly, then picked up his phone. Janet, can you pull the Morrison & Associates file? I want to see their last 3 years of financial statements. He hung up and turned back to me. Here's what I'm thinking. Meridian Capital is prepared to provide the financing for your acquisition, but we want to see this framework in action first. Are you willing to run a larger test? My heart was racing, but I kept my expression calm. What did you have in mind? There's a mid-sized company called Blackstone Retail that's been struggling with their marketing. They're spending $50,000 a month with minimal results. If you can demonstrate the same kind of improvement you showed with Martinez Construction, we'll move forward with the Morrison & Associates deal. It was a massive risk. Blackstone Retail was 50 times larger than Martinez Construction, with a complex product line and multiple target demographics. But it was also exactly the kind of challenge I'd been preparing for. I'll need access to their current data, their customer demographics, and their existing marketing materials, I said. And I'll need complete creative control for 60 days. David grinned. You'll have it. But Alice, understand what you're agreeing to. If this fails, your acquisition plan is dead. Meridian Capital doesn't invest in people who can't deliver results. I thought about the crumpled rejection letters in my trash can, the snickers from the boardroom, the way Bradley Morrison had dismissed me as nothing more than a minimum wage loser. I understand, I said. When do I start? 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the Blackstone Retail conference room, presenting my strategy to their CEO, Linda Patterson. Unlike Bradley Morrison, Linda actually listened to my ideas. She asked intelligent questions, challenged my assumptions, and pushed me to refine my approach. By the end of the meeting, she was nodding approvingly. Alice, she said, I'm not sure what Morrison & Associates was thinking when they kept you in that junior position. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. The comment stung, but not in the way Linda intended. It was validation that I'd been right all along. I wasn't a minimum wage loser. I was a strategist who'd been trapped in the wrong environment, underestimated by people who couldn't see talent when it was sitting right in front of them. The Blackstone Retail campaign launched on a Monday morning. Within the first week, their online engagement had increased by 200%. By the end of the month, their lead generation had improved by 180%, and their conversion rate had jumped by 45%. The results were so dramatic that Linda Patterson called David Kim personally to recommend me for additional projects. I don't know where you found this girl, she told him, but she's going to revolutionize the marketing industry. David forwarded me the voicemail with a simple message. Ready to buy a company? That night, I sat in my studio apartment, surrounded by the same post-it notes and financial documents that had been my constant companions for months. But something had changed. I was no longer the minimum wage employee desperately trying to prove herself. I was a proven marketing strategist with a track record of success and the backing of a major venture capital firm. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Saw the news about Blackstone Retail. Their stock jumped 15% today. You're actually going to pull this off, aren't you? I smiled as I typed back. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. Phase 2 was the acquisition itself. David Kim had already begun the preliminary negotiations, using shell companies and legal proxies to keep my identity secret. Morrison & Associates' board of directors thought they were dealing with a mysterious corporate buyer interested in expanding their marketing portfolio. They had no idea that their minimum wage employee was orchestrating the entire transaction. The irony was perfect. Bradley Morrison, who'd dismissed me as too low class to understand business, was about to sell his company to the girl he'd humiliated in that boardroom. And when the deal closed, I would become his boss, with the power to make him feel exactly as small and insignificant as he'd made me feel. But first, I had to survive the due diligence process, the background checks, and the countless meetings with lawyers and accountants. Because buying a company wasn't just about having the money, it was about proving that you deserved to own it. The minimum wage loser was about to become a CEO. And Bradley Morrison was about to learn that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who end up changing everything. The acquisition moved forward like a perfectly choreographed dance, and I was pulling the strings while still showing up to my cubicle every morning at 6:30 a.m. For 6 weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Alice Reynolds, the minimum wage marketing coordinator who fetched coffee and filed paperwork. By night, I was the anonymous buyer slowly circling Morrison and Associates like a shark sensing blood in the water. David Kim's team had done their homework. Morrison and Associates was even more vulnerable than my initial analysis had suggested. The company's debt-to-equity ratio was climbing toward dangerous territory. Their largest client, Paramount Industries, was 3 months behind on payments, creating a cash flow crisis that Bradley Morrison was trying to hide from his board of directors. Most telling of all, their employee turnover rate had spiked to 40% in the past year, with exit interviews consistently citing poor management and lack of growth opportunities. I watched it all unfold from my front row seat in the cubicle farm. Every morning brought new signs of the company's decline. The executive parking lot, once filled with luxury cars, now had 3 empty spaces where former VPs used to park. The break room coffee had been downgraded from premium to generic. The annual holiday party had been quietly canceled, replaced with a modest lunch in the conference room. But Bradley Morrison continued his charade of success, strutting through the office in his expensive suits, taking credit for other people's work, and treating employees like disposable resources. He had no idea that his company was being systematically evaluated by a team of forensic accountants and business analysts who reported directly to the woman he'd dismissed as a, quote, minimum wage loser. The first crack in his facade appeared on a Thursday morning in October. I was at my desk, pretending to work on a client proposal while actually reviewing the latest due diligence reports on my phone, when I heard raised voices coming from Bradley's office. Through the glass walls, I could see him pacing frantically while Patricia Hawkins sat rigid in her chair, her face pale with concern. "What do you mean? We're 3 months behind on payroll taxes," Bradley's voice carried across the office, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's Patricia's job to handle." Patricia's response was too quiet to make out, but her body language spoke volumes. She was shaking her head, pointing to documents on Bradley's desk, clearly trying to explain something he didn't want to hear. It was the kind of scene that would have terrified me 6 months ago, but now I watched with the detached interest of someone who knew exactly how this story would end. The payroll tax issue wasn't news to me. David Kim's financial team had flagged it weeks ago as part of their comprehensive audit. Morrison and Associates owed $180,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. It was the kind of problem that competent management would have addressed immediately, but Bradley had apparently been hoping it would somehow resolve itself. I pulled up the encrypted messaging app that David's team used for sensitive communications. "Target is experiencing a cash flow crisis," I typed. "Payroll tax delinquency now public knowledge among staff. Recommend accelerating timeline." The response came within minutes. "Understood. The legal team prepared to submit a formal offer by the end of the week. Are you ready?" Was I ready? I looked around the office at my coworkers, most of whom had no idea their jobs were hanging by a thread. Jennifer Walsh was on yet another personal call, probably planning her weekend shopping trip. Thomas Chen was playing solitaire on his computer, completely oblivious to the crisis unfolding 20 feet away. These people had laughed at my presentation, dismissed my ideas, and treated me like I was invisible. But they were also about to become my employees, and I felt an unexpected surge of responsibility. When the acquisition went through, I would be responsible for their livelihoods, their careers, their futures. It was a sobering thought that made the whole plan feel suddenly real. "Ready," I typed back. "Proceed with an offer." The formal acquisition offer arrived at Morrison & Associates on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a courier in a black sedan who looked like he belonged in a spy movie. I watched from my cubicle as Bradley's assistant, Nancy, signed for the thick manila envelope and carried it into his office with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legal documents. Which, of course, it was. I pretended to be absorbed in my work while keeping one eye on Bradley's office. Through the glass walls, I could see him reading the documents with growing confusion, then alarm, then something approaching panic. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, his free hand gesturing wildly as he spoke. The call lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Bradley slumped back in his chair, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who just realized he was out of options. The acquisition offer was generous, probably more than the company was worth in its current state, but it came with conditions that made it clear this wasn't a friendly takeover. The mysterious buyer, identified only as AR Holdings LLC, wanted complete control of operations, immediate access to all financial records, and the right to restructure management as needed. In corporate speak, it was a polite way of saying that everyone currently in charge was about to be replaced. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction as I watched Bradley struggle with the reality of his situation. For years, he'd coasted on his father's reputation and his own sense of entitlement. Now he was facing the consequences of his incompetence, and there was no MBA program or family connection that could save him. The weekend passed in a blur of conference calls and legal reviews. David Kim's team worked around the clock to finalize the acquisition terms, while I prepared for the most challenging performance of my life. Come Monday morning, I would have to continue playing the role of the oblivious minimum wage employee while secretly orchestrating the purchase of the company that employed me. Monday brought unexpected drama. I arrived at the office to find the parking lot buzzing with activity. 3 black SUVs were parked in the visitor spaces, and men in expensive suits were walking in and out of the building carrying briefcases and legal folders. The acquisition was moving into high gear, and everyone could feel the tension. "Did you hear?" Jennifer Walsh cornered me by the elevator, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Someone's trying to buy the company." Bradley called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. I arranged my features into an expression of mild concern. "Buy the company? Who would want to do that?" "Nobody knows," Jennifer said, clearly relishing the drama. "But whoever it is, they're serious." I heard Patricia telling someone on the phone that they've already completed the financial due diligence. The elevator doors opened and we rode up in silence. I spent the morning in a state of controlled excitement, watching the corporate ballet unfold around me. Lawyers huddled in conference rooms, accountants pored over financial statements, and executives whispered in hallways like conspirators planning a coup. At 2 p.m., Bradley called an all-hands meeting. The entire staff gathered in the main conference room, the same room where I'd been humiliated 3 months earlier. Bradley stood at the head of the table, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled, his confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. "I want to address the rumors that have been circulating," he began, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "Morrison & Associates has received an acquisition offer from an investment group called AR Holdings. The board is currently reviewing the terms, and no decisions have been made." He paused, scanning the room with the expression of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "I want to assure everyone that this company remains committed to our current strategic direction. We've built something special here, and we're not going to let outside interests derail our progress." The speech was pure Bradley Morrison, full of corporate buzzwords and empty promises. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes. He knew his empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, pretending to clean up, while actually savoring the moment. This was where Bradley had called me a minimum wage loser, where he'd dismissed my ideas as the fantasies of a delusional receptionist. Now, 3 months later, I was about to become the owner of everything he'd inherited. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The formal acceptance came on Wednesday morning. Bradley's assistant announced that there would be another all-hands meeting at 10 a.m., and the grim expressions on the executives' faces told the whole story. Morrison & Associates had been sold to AR Holdings LLC for $28 million, contingent on the new owner's right to restructure operations immediately. I sat in my usual spot in the back of the conference room, watching Bradley deliver the news with all the enthusiasm of a man reading his own obituary. The sale would be finalized within 30 days, after which the new management team would take control of daily operations. "The new owners have assured me that they're committed to maintaining Morrison & Associates' reputation for excellence," Bradley said, the words sounding hollow even to him. "They've indicated that most current employees will be retained, subject to performance evaluations and operational needs." Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. Do we know anything about the new owners? What kind of company is AR Holdings? Bradley's jaw tightened. AR Holdings is a private investment firm focused on marketing and communications companies. Beyond that, they've chosen to remain anonymous until the transition is complete. I bit back a smile. AR Holdings was indeed focused on marketing and communications, but it wasn't exactly a firm in the traditional sense. The AR stood for Alice Reynolds, and the Holdings part referred to the fact that I was about to hold the keys to Bradley Morrison's kingdom. After the meeting, I walked back to my cubicle with measured steps, maintaining the same routine I'd followed for 3 years. But everything had changed. In 30 days, I would walk into that same conference room as the CEO of Morrison & Associates, and Bradley Morrison would be nothing more than a former employee whose services were no longer required. The next few weeks passed in a surreal haze of normalcy and hidden preparation. I continued to show up for work every day, filing reports and answering phones, while secretly coordinating the transition with David Kim's team. The other employees went about their daily routines, unaware that their minimum wage coworker was about to become their boss. I used the time to carefully observe everyone, taking mental notes about who showed real potential and who was simply coasting on the company's previous success. Jennifer Walsh, despite her annoying personality, was actually quite skilled at client management. Thomas Chen, when he wasn't playing computer games, had a genuine talent for operational efficiency. Even Patricia Hawkins, Bradley's loyal enforcer, had valuable experience that could be useful under different management. But I also identified the problems that would need to be addressed immediately. The company's entire digital infrastructure was outdated by at least 5 years. The client database was a mess of duplicate entries and missing information. The marketing strategies were still based on tactics that had been effective in the early 2000s, but were completely irrelevant in the current market. Most importantly, I began developing my plan for the moment of truth. The day when I would walk into that conference room and reveal that the minimum wage loser they dismissed was now their CEO. It would be a moment of perfect poetic justice, but it would also be the beginning of the real work. Because buying the company was only the first step. Turning it into the kind of marketing powerhouse I knew it could become would require every ounce of skill, determination, and strategic thinking I possessed. I would have to prove that I deserved to own Morrison & Associates, not just to the employees who had underestimated me, but to myself. The closing date was set for November 15th, a Tuesday that would forever change the trajectory of my life. As the day approached, I found myself oscillating between excitement and terror. I was about to achieve something that had seemed impossible just 4 months earlier, but I was also about to take responsibility for 37 employees, millions of dollars in revenue, and a reputation that had been built over 3 decades. The night before the closing, I sat in my studio apartment, surrounded by the same post-it notes and financial documents that had been my constant companions throughout this journey. Tomorrow, I would sign papers that would make me the owner of Morrison & Associates. The day after that, I would walk into that office as the CEO, and Bradley Morrison would learn what it felt like to be on the other side of the power equation. The minimum wage loser was about to become the boss, and the quiet revolution I'd been planning in secret was about to become very, very loud. November 15th arrived with the kind of crisp Chicago morning that made everything feel electric with possibility. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my new navy suit. Not the clearance rack special I'd worn to that disastrous presentation, but a proper executive suit that cost more than my monthly rent. Today, I would need to look like the CEO I was about to become. The closing took place at the law offices of Brennan, Stone & Associates, a prestigious firm that occupied 3 floors of a downtown skyscraper. I walked through the marble lobby at exactly 9 a.m., my heels clicking against the polished stone with newfound confidence. David Kim was waiting by the elevators, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with anticipation. "Ready to make history?" he asked quietly as we rode up to the 42nd floor. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. In 2 hours, I would own Morrison & Associates. By lunchtime, I would be the CEO of the company that had dismissed me as worthless. The conference room was intimidating in its grandeur, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. A massive mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. Legal documents were arranged in neat stacks, each one representing a different aspect of the most complex transaction of my life. Bradley Morrison arrived 15 minutes later, flanked by his attorney and looking like a man walking to his own execution. He wore his most expensive suit, but it couldn't hide the defeat in his posture or the dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me sitting at the table, his step faltered slightly. "Alice!" His voice carried a note of confusion. "What are you doing here?" David Kim stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet Alice Reynolds, the principal behind AR Holdings LLC. The color drained from Bradley's face as the implications hit him. He stared at me for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His attorney, a sharp-looking woman named Margaret Walsh, quickly stepped forward to fill the silence. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "My client was under the impression that AR Holdings was an established investment firm." "AR Holdings is an investment vehicle," David replied smoothly. "Ms. Reynolds is the sole proprietor and decision-maker for all investments." Bradley finally found his voice. "You're telling me that Alice Reynolds, my minimum wage employee, is buying my company?" "Former employee," I corrected, speaking for the first time since he'd entered the room. "And yes, Mr. Morrison, I'm buying your company." The next hour was a masterclass in corporate warfare disguised as a business meeting. Bradley's attorney tried every legal maneuver she could think of to delay or derail the transaction. She questioned my financial backing, demanded additional due diligence, and even suggested that the acquisition might represent a conflict of interest. But David Kim's legal team had anticipated every objection. They produced bank statements, investment agreements, and letters of credit that proved beyond any doubt that AR Holdings had both the financial resources and the legal authority to complete the purchase. Every document was pristine, every signature notarized, every detail bulletproof. "This is insane," Bradley muttered, slumping in his chair. "You're a receptionist. You don't know anything about running a company." "Marketing coordinator," I corrected again, "and I know more about running your company than you do." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Bradley's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought he might actually explode. But Margaret Walsh placed a restraining hand on his arm, clearly recognizing that emotional outbursts wouldn't change the legal reality. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "the terms of the acquisition are standard for this type of transaction. The purchase price is fair, and the buyer has met all contractual obligations. I strongly recommend that we proceed." Bradley looked like he wanted to argue, but the numbers didn't lie. Morrison & Associates was hemorrhaging money, and the $28 million offer was probably more than he could get from any other buyer. He was trapped, and everyone in the room knew it. The actual signing took 20 minutes. Page after page of legal documents, each one transferring a piece of Richard Morrison's legacy, from his incompetent son to the minimum wage employee he'd dismissed. Bradley's signature became increasingly shaky as the magnitude of what was happening sank in. When the last document was signed, David Kim stood and shook my hand formally. "Congratulations, Ms. Reynolds. You are now the owner of Morrison & Associates." I looked across the table at Bradley, who was staring at the signed papers with the expression of someone who'd just watched his world collapse. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "I'll need to speak with you about your future with the company." His head snapped up, a flicker of hope crossing his features. "My future?" "Your severance package," I clarified. "Effective immediately, your employment with Morrison & Associates is terminated." The hope died in his eyes, replaced by something that looked like rage. "You can't do this. My father built this company. I've been there for 10 years. "Your father built this company," I agreed. "And you've spent the last 5 years destroying it." The board voted unanimously to accept the acquisition offer because they knew you were driving the company into bankruptcy. Margaret Walsh cleared her throat. "The severance terms are outlined in Section 12 of the acquisition agreement. Mr. Morrison will receive 6 months' salary and benefits, plus accrued vacation time." It was generous, probably more than Bradley deserved. But I wasn't interested in being vindictive. I was interested in being successful. "I don't understand," Bradley said, his voice rising. "How is this possible? How did you get the money? How did you even know about the company's financial problems?" I stood and gathered my copy of the signed documents. I got the money the same way anyone gets money for a business acquisition. I presented a compelling case to investors. As for the company's financial problems, they weren't exactly hidden. Anyone with basic business knowledge could see that Morrison & Associates was failing under your leadership. The truth was more complicated, of course. I'd spent months analyzing every aspect of the company's operations, identifying weaknesses that Bradley was too incompetent to recognize. But there was no point in explaining that to him now. "This isn't over," Bradley said, his voice low and threatening. "I'll fight this. I'll find a way to prove that you're not qualified to run this company." I paused at the door and turned back to face him. "Mr. Morrison, you're welcome to try. But I'd suggest you use your energy more productively. Maybe take some time to figure out what you actually want to do with your life, now that you can't coast on your father's reputation anymore." The elevator ride down felt like a descent from Mount Olympus. I was no longer Alice Reynolds, the minimum wage employee who fetched coffee and filed paperwork. I was Alice Reynolds, CEO of Morrison & Associates, owner of a multi-million-dollar marketing company. But the real test was yet to come. Owning the company was one thing. Running it successfully was another. And I had about 4 hours to prepare for the most important presentation of my life. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. I spent the morning at a nearby hotel reviewing my notes and preparing for the reactions I was about to face. Some employees would be shocked, others would be skeptical, and a few would probably be openly hostile. I needed to be ready for all of them. At 1:45 p.m., I walked into the Morrison & Associates building as the owner for the first time. Miguel, the security guard, did a double-take when he saw me in my executive suit, but he smiled and nodded just like always. "Afternoon, Miss Reynolds. You're looking very professional today." "Thank you, Miguel. It's going to be an interesting day." I took the elevator to the 15th floor, my heart pounding with anticipation. The office looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. The cubicle where I had spent 3 years was now the workspace of an employee, not my own desk. The conference room where I'd been humiliated was now my conference room. Nancy, Bradley's former assistant, was waiting by the elevators with a confused expression. "Alice? Mr. Morrison is looking for you. He seems very upset about something." "I'm sure he is," I said. "Could you please gather everyone in the main conference room? I have an announcement to make." Word spread quickly through the office that something big was happening. Employees abandoned their desks and gathered in the conference room, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. I recognized every face, remembered every slight, every dismissive comment, every moment when I'd been treated as invisible. Jennifer Walsh was there, perfectly dressed and perfectly clueless. Thomas Chen looked annoyed at being pulled away from his computer. Patricia Hawkins sat in the front row, her expression neutral but her eyes watchful. They were all there, waiting to hear from their new CEO. I walked to the front of the room and stood behind the podium, the same spot where Bradley had delivered his corporate speeches and empty promises. The room fell silent, 37 pairs of eyes focused on me with varying degrees of confusion. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice clear and confident. "I'm sure many of you are wondering why I've called this meeting. As you know, Morrison & Associates was recently acquired by AR Holdings, LLC. What you don't know is that I am AR Holdings, LLC. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the confusion on their faces as they processed what I'd just said. Jennifer Walsh's mouth fell open. Thomas Chen looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Patricia Hawkins leaned forward in her chair, her professional composure cracking for the first time since I'd known her. "Effective immediately," I continued, "I am the owner and CEO of Morrison & Associates. Bradley Morrison's employment has been terminated, and I will be taking over all executive responsibilities." The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. Someone in the back row said, "Is this some kind of joke?" Another voice asked, "How is this possible?" I raised my hand for silence. I know this comes as a shock. 3 months ago, I was sitting in this same room, presenting ideas that were dismissed as the fantasies of a minimum wage employee. Today, I'm the owner of this company. That transformation didn't happen by accident. I clicked to my first slide, a comprehensive overview of Morrison & Associates' financial performance over the past 2 years. The numbers were devastating: declining revenue, increasing costs, deteriorating profit margins. This company was failing, I said bluntly. Not because of market conditions, not because of increased competition, but because of poor management and outdated strategies. I saw the problems, I developed solutions, and I found investors who believed in my vision. Jennifer Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Alice, I don't understand. How did you get the money to buy the company? The same way anyone gets money for a business acquisition, I replied. I demonstrated to investors that I could turn this company around and make it profitable. I showed them my track record, my strategies, and my plans for the future. I clicked to the next slide, showing the results of my work with Martinez Construction and Blackstone Retail. The numbers were impressive, undeniable proof that my methods worked. Some of you may be wondering if I'm qualified to run this company, I continued. The answer is simple. I'm more qualified than the person who was running it before me. I've spent the last 2 years developing innovative marketing strategies while the previous management was content to rely on outdated methods. Thomas Chen stood up, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You're a receptionist. You don't have an MBA. You don't have management experience. How can you possibly think you can run a company like this? The room fell silent again, waiting for my response. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The confrontation that would define my credibility as a leader. Thomas, I said, my voice calm but firm, you're absolutely right. I don't have an MBA, I have something better. I have results. While Bradley Morrison was playing golf and taking long lunches, I was studying this industry, analyzing our competitors, and developing strategies that actually work. I clicked to the next slide, showing a detailed comparison of Morrison & Associates' performance versus industry leaders. The gaps were enormous, embarrassing proof of how far the company had fallen under Bradley's leadership. I may not have a fancy degree, I continued, but I have something that can't be taught in business school, the ability to see what's actually happening instead of what I want to be happening. This company was dying, and everyone in this room knew it. The only question was whether someone would step up to save it. Patricia Hawkins raised her hand. Alice, what does this mean for the rest of us? Are you planning to fire everyone and start over? It was a fair question, and I could see the fear in her eyes. Despite her loyalty to Bradley, Patricia was a skilled professional who genuinely cared about the company's success. Patricia, I'm not interested in firing people who can contribute to this company's success, I said. I'm interested in creating an environment where talented people can thrive. Some of you will find new opportunities for growth and advancement. Others may discover that this isn't the right fit for them anymore. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. I'm not asking you to like this situation. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I can make this company successful again. Judge me by my results, not by my background. The meeting continued for another hour, with questions ranging from practical concerns about benefits and job security to more philosophical discussions about the company's future direction. I answered each question directly and honestly, making it clear that I was serious about turning Morrison & Associates into an industry leader. When the meeting finally ended, the employees filed out with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to outright skepticism. I remained at the podium, watching them go and wondering how many would still be there in 6 months. Jennifer Walsh approached me as the room was clearing. Alice, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I had no idea you were capable of something like this. Jennifer, I replied, I don't need apologies. I need results. If you're willing to work hard and embrace new ways of doing things, you'll find opportunities here that you never imagined. If you're not, you'll probably be happier somewhere else. She nodded slowly and walked away, leaving me alone in the conference room where my journey had begun, the same room where Bradley Morrison had called me a minimum wage loser, where he'd dismissed my ideas as worthless, where he'd made it clear that I would never be anything more than support staff. Now it was my conference room, in my company, and Bradley Morrison was looking for a new job. The first confrontation was over, I had won. But the real work was just beginning. The first week as CEO of Morrison & Associates felt like trying to rebuild a plane while flying it. Every day brought new crises that Bradley Morrison had either ignored or mishandled. The Paramount Industries payment issue wasn't just 3 months overdue. It was actually 6 months, and they were threatening to terminate their contract entirely. 2 other major clients were actively shopping for new agencies after being neglected for months. The company's cash reserves were down to $180,000, barely enough to cover 2 weeks of payroll. But the real test came on Friday morning, when Margaret Walsh, Bradley's former attorney, appeared in my office with a briefcase full of legal documents and a smile that could have frozen Lake Michigan. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. "I represent the Morrison Family Trust, and we have some concerns about the legitimacy of your acquisition." I leaned back in my chair, the same executive chair that Bradley had occupied just days earlier. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that could result in this entire transaction being voided," she replied, pulling out a thick folder. "We have evidence that suggests you used insider information to manipulate the acquisition process. Corporate espionage is a serious crime, Ms. Reynolds." The accusation hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's a serious allegation. I hope you have evidence to support it." Margaret smiled and spread several photographs across my desk. They showed me leaving the office late at night, arriving early in the morning, and meeting with people who could have been investors or lawyers. To someone looking for conspiracy, they might seem suspicious. To anyone who knew the truth, they were simply evidence of someone who worked harder than everyone else. "We also have testimony from former employees who claim you had access to confidential financial information," she continued. "Information that would have been essential for conducting the kind of due diligence that convinced your investors to back the acquisition." I studied the photographs carefully, buying time while my mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just about legal threats, it was about public perception. If the Morrison family could create enough doubt about the legitimacy of my acquisition, they could damage my credibility and potentially scare away the clients I was trying to retain. "Ms. Walsh," I said finally, "I'm going to give you some free legal advice. If you're planning to file a lawsuit based on these photographs and anonymous testimony, you should probably find a better case. Because what you're describing isn't corporate espionage, it's called being a dedicated employee." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. I had access to financial information because I was responsible for preparing client reports and maintaining billing records. I worked late because I cared about this company's success more than its CEO did. And I met with investors because I had a legitimate business plan and the track record to support it. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "The Morrison family isn't going to let you destroy their legacy." "The Morrison family legacy?" I turned back to face her. "Let me tell you about the Morrison family legacy. Richard Morrison built this company from nothing through hard work and innovation. His son Bradley inherited it and spent 5 years running it into the ground through incompetence and arrogance. I'm not destroying the Morrison legacy, I'm saving it." The confrontation continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret making increasingly desperate threats and me responding with calm professionalism. Finally, she gathered her documents and stood to leave. "This isn't over, Ms. Reynolds. The Morrison family has resources and connections that you can't imagine." "I'm sure they do," I replied, "but I have something they don't have, the ability to actually run this company successfully. And in the end, that's what matters." After she left, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of concern. Legal battles were expensive and time-consuming, and I couldn't afford either. But I also couldn't allow the Morrison family to intimidate me into backing down. I picked up my phone and called David Kim. "We may have a problem," I said, explaining the morning's confrontation. "Let me make some calls," he replied. "But Alice, you need to understand something. The best defense against accusations like this is success. If you can turn Morrison and Associates around quickly and decisively, it becomes much harder for anyone to argue that you shouldn't be running the company." He was right, of course. The ultimate test wasn't going to be fought in courtrooms. It was going to be fought in the marketplace. I needed to prove that I could deliver results, not just promises. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On Monday morning, I received a call from Marcus Thompson, the CEO of Dynamo Corporation, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the Midwest. Dynamo was launching a new product line and needed a complete marketing campaign within 6 weeks. It was exactly the kind of high-profile, high-pressure project that could make or break a marketing agency. "I'll be honest with you, Alice," Marcus said during our phone conversation. "I've been watching what happened at Morrison & Associates with great interest. The business community is buzzing with rumors about the new owner who came out of nowhere to buy the company. Some people are saying you're a visionary. Others are saying you're in over your head." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you think?" "I think results speak louder than rumors," he replied. Dynamo is prepared to offer Morrison & Associates a $2.5 million contract for this campaign. It's a 6-week timeline with performance metrics that would challenge even the most established agencies. If you can deliver, it would be a career-defining project. If you can't, it would be a very public failure. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A successful campaign would validate my leadership and provide the cash flow needed to stabilize the company. A failure would give the Morrison family ammunition for their legal challenges and potentially destroy my credibility in the industry. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "Morrison & Associates accepts your challenge." The next 6 weeks were a blur of 18-hour days, strategic planning sessions, and the kind of intense creativity that comes from knowing your entire future depends on the outcome. I assembled a team of the company's best talent, including some people who had initially been skeptical of my leadership. Jennifer Walsh, despite her initial doubts, proved to be invaluable in managing client relationships. Thomas Chen, once he got past his resentment about my promotion, demonstrated genuine skill in project management. Even Patricia Hawkins, who had been Bradley's loyal enforcer, threw herself into the project with the dedication of someone who finally had a leader worth following. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. During the second week of the project, I was working late in my office when I heard a knock on the door. It was Miguel, the security guard, holding a cup of coffee and looking slightly uncomfortable. "Miss Reynolds," he said, "I hope you don't mind me bothering you, but I had an idea about your campaign." I looked up from my computer, surprised. "Of course, Miguel. What's your idea?" He sat down hesitantly, clearly nervous about speaking up. "Well, I've been watching the presentations and the focus group materials, and I think you're missing something important. All the marketing I've seen focuses on the technical features of the product, but you're not talking about what it means to the people who will actually use it." He pulled out a folded piece of paper covered with handwritten notes. "My wife works in manufacturing, and she's been telling me about how hard it is to find equipment that's both reliable and affordable. Your client's product solves both problems, but your campaign is talking about specifications instead of solutions." I studied his notes, my excitement growing with each suggestion. Miguel had identified the emotional core of the campaign that my team of marketing professionals had missed. It wasn't about the technical superiority of the product, it was about the peace of mind that came from knowing you could depend on your equipment. "Miguel," I said, "this is brilliant. Would you be willing to work with the creative team to develop these ideas?" His face lit up. "Really? You'd want my help?" "I'd want your leadership," I replied. "You understand the customer better than anyone else on this project." The inclusion of Miguel's insights transformed the entire campaign. Instead of focusing on technical specifications, we built the messaging around reliability, dependability, and the confidence that comes from using superior equipment. The tagline became, "Built for the people who build America," and the imagery showcased real manufacturing workers in actual workplace settings. The campaign launch was scheduled for a Friday morning presentation at Dynamo Corporation's headquarters. I arrived early, carrying presentation materials and a confidence that was partly real and partly performance. The conference room was packed with Dynamo executives, industry analysts, and representatives from competing agencies who wanted to see if the new owner of Morrison & Associates could deliver on her promises. Marcus Thompson introduced me with a brief overview of the project parameters and the aggressive timeline we'd been given. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Alice Reynolds, CEO of Morrison & Associates." The next hour was the most important presentation of my career. I walked the audience through every aspect of the campaign, from the initial market research to the final creative execution. I showed them data that proved our messaging would resonate with the target demographic. I demonstrated how our digital strategy would reach customers more effectively than traditional advertising methods. But the real magic happened when I introduced Miguel as a key contributor to the campaign's development. His insights about the emotional needs of manufacturing workers had shaped every aspect of the creative strategy, and his authenticity came through in every word he spoke. This campaign doesn't just sell a product, I concluded. It speaks to the pride and professionalism of the people who keep America running. It's not just marketing, it's recognition of the value and dignity of hard work. The room was silent for a moment after I finished. Then Marcus Thompson started clapping, and the rest of the audience joined in. It wasn't polite applause. It was the kind of enthusiastic response that comes from witnessing something genuinely impressive. "Alice," Marcus said, "I have to admit I wasn't sure what to expect when I gave you this project. But what you've presented today is exactly what we hoped for. The campaign is approved, and Dynamo Corporation looks forward to a long relationship with Morrison & Associates." The celebration that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 3 years as a minimum wage employee. My team gathered around me, their faces glowing with pride and accomplishment. Jennifer Walsh actually hugged me, something that would have been unthinkable just 2 months earlier. Thomas Chen shook my hand and said, "I was wrong about you, Alice. You're the leader this company needed." But the moment that meant the most came from Patricia Hawkins, who had been Bradley's closest ally and had every reason to resent my success. "Alice," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I've never been more proud to work for this company. You've shown us what real leadership looks like." The success of the Dynamo campaign had immediate and far-reaching effects. Within a week, 3 new clients had contacted Morrison & Associates about potential projects. Industry publications ran articles about the dramatic turnaround at the company. Most importantly, the legal threats from the Morrison family quietly disappeared, as it became clear that public opinion had shifted decisively in my favor. The campaign also had personal significance that went beyond business success. It proved that my vision for Morrison & Associates wasn't just theoretical, it was practical and achievable. More importantly, it demonstrated that my leadership style, which emphasized collaboration and recognizing talent wherever it came from, could produce results that traditional hierarchical management couldn't match. 2 months after the presentation, I was sitting in my office reviewing the quarterly financial reports when Jennifer Walsh knocked on my door. "Alice," she said, "there's someone here to see you." I looked up to see Bradley Morrison standing in my doorway, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 months. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked like defeat. "Hello, Bradley," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "What can I do for you?" He sat down heavily, avoiding my eyes. "I came to apologize," he said quietly, "and to ask for a job." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Bradley Morrison, the man who had called me a minimum wage loser, who had dismissed my ideas as worthless, who had made it clear that I would never be anything more than support staff, was asking me for employment. "I've been blacklisted," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Word got out about how I ran the company into the ground, and nobody in the industry will hire me. I've burned through my savings, and I'm facing bankruptcy." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the arrogance that had defined him just months earlier. It was gone, replaced by genuine humility and desperation. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, "but I'm asking you to give me a chance. I'll take any position you have available. I just need a job." The irony was almost overwhelming. The man who had inherited a multi-million-dollar company and ran it into the ground was asking for mercy from the woman he had humiliated and dismissed. The ultimate test wasn't about proving I could run the company. It was about proving what kind of leader I would be when given the chance to show mercy or seek revenge. I leaned back in my chair, considering my options. I could refuse his request and let him face the consequences of his actions. I could hire him for a menial position and enjoy the satisfaction of watching him struggle. Or I could take a different path entirely. "Bradley," I said finally, "I'm going to offer you something better than a job. I'm going to offer you an education." He looked up sharply, confusion replacing the desperation in his eyes. "You can work here as a consultant," I continued. You'll help me understand the industry relationships your father built, and I'll teach you how to actually run a marketing company. It won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable, but if you're willing to learn, you might discover that you have more potential than either of us realized." The offer was generous, probably more than he deserved, but it was also strategic. Bradley knew the industry's history and had connections that could be valuable. More importantly, giving him a chance to redeem himself would send a message to the entire business community about the kind of leader I intended to be. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would you help me after what I did to you?" I smiled, remembering the frightened girl who had sat in this same chair just months earlier, dismissed and humiliated by the man who was now asking for my help. "Because success isn't about getting revenge," I replied. "It's about building something better than what came before. And sometimes, that means giving people a chance to be better than they were." The ultimate test was complete. I had proven that I could run Morrison & Associates successfully, but more importantly, I had proven that I could lead with both strength and compassion. The minimum wage loser had become not just a CEO, but the kind of leader who could transform not just companies, but the people who worked for them. The real victory wasn't buying Bradley Morrison's company. It was becoming the kind of person who could offer him a chance at redemption. 6 months after the Dynamo campaign, Morrison & Associates had transformed from a failing company into the most talked-about marketing agency in the Midwest. Our client roster had doubled, our revenue had increased by 180%, and we'd been featured on the cover of Marketing Today magazine with the headline, "The Phoenix Rising: How Alice Reynolds Rebuilt an Empire." But success brought new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. The industry that had once dismissed me as a minimum wage loser was now watching my every move, waiting for signs of failure or weakness. Competitors who had ignored Morrison & Associates when Bradley was running it into the ground were now actively trying to poach our clients and steal our strategies. The most aggressive threat came from Zenith Marketing, the same company I'd studied during my cubicle days. Their CEO, Victoria Sterling, was a Harvard MBA with 15 years of experience and a reputation for ruthless business practices. She'd built Zenith into a $50 million operation by acquiring smaller agencies and absorbing their client lists. Now she had her sights set on my company. The war began subtly. Zenith started offering our clients significantly reduced rates for similar services, sometimes at prices that couldn't possibly be profitable. They hired away 2 of our junior executives, with salary offers that were 40% above market rate. Most concerning, they'd somehow obtained detailed information about our internal processes, and were using that knowledge to undercut our proposals. I was analyzing the latest competitive intelligence reports when Sarah Martinez knocked on my office door. My old friend from community college had left Goldman Sachs 3 months earlier to become Morrison & Associates' chief financial officer, bringing Wall Street expertise to our rapidly growing operation. "Alice," she said, her expression grim, "we need to talk. Zenith just submitted a proposal to Paramount Industries that's almost identical to ours, but priced at 30% less." I looked up from my laptop, feeling a familiar surge of competitive fire. How identical? Identical enough that they either have someone on the inside or they've been conducting industrial espionage, Sarah replied. The proposal structure, the creative concepts, even some of the specific language matches our work. Industrial espionage. The same accusation that Margaret Walsh had leveled against me months earlier. But this time, it was real, and it was being used against my company. "Any idea how they're getting the information?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "I've had our IT department run security audits on all our systems." Nothing obvious. But Alice, there's something else. 3 of our biggest clients have received calls from Zenith recruiters trying to hire away our account teams. They're not just trying to steal our business. They're trying to steal our people. The corporate raid was a classic Victoria Sterling move. She'd used the same tactics to destroy 2 other agencies over the past 5 years, systematically dismantling their operations before moving in for the kill. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd chosen to target someone who had already survived much worse than anything she could dish out. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to set up a meeting with our entire management team. It's time to show Zenith Marketing what happens when they mess with people who've already been through hell. The war room meeting took place that afternoon in the main conference room. I'd assembled my core team: Sarah Martinez handling financial strategy, Jennifer Walsh managing client relations, Thomas Chen overseeing operations, Patricia Hawkins coordinating human resources, and Miguel Rodriguez, who had been promoted to Director of Creative Insights after his success with the Dynamo campaign. Zenith Marketing has declared war on us, I began, pulling up a slide showing their recent aggressive moves. They're trying to destroy our company using the same tactics they've used against smaller agencies. The question is, are we going to let them? The room erupted in voices as everyone tried to speak at once. Jennifer was furious about the client poaching attempts. Thomas was concerned about the security breaches. Patricia was worried about employee retention. Miguel, characteristically, was the first to offer a solution. "What if we're approaching this wrong?" he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Zenith is fighting a traditional corporate war, trying to destroy us through attrition and price competition. But we're not a traditional corporate enemy. We're the company that rebuilt itself from nothing. Maybe we should fight like that." I leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Miguel stood and walked to the whiteboard, sketching out a diagram as he spoke. "Victoria Sterling's weakness is that she thinks like a corporate raider. She sees companies as assets to be acquired and competitors as enemies to be destroyed. But what if we made her an offer she couldn't refuse?" "You're talking about acquiring Zenith?" Sarah asked, her eyes widening. "Alice, they're 3 times our size. Even with our recent success, we don't have the resources for a hostile takeover." "Not a hostile takeover," Miguel replied. "A merger. But not the kind she's expecting." He turned to face the group, his expression serious. "What if we offered to merge the 2 companies under a joint leadership structure? Zenith gets our innovative strategies and client loyalty. We get their resources and market reach. Victoria Sterling gets to keep her title and her ego, but we control the actual operations." It was a brilliant strategy, but it required a level of corporate maneuvering that would make David Kim proud. More importantly, it would require me to sit across a negotiating table from Victoria Sterling and convince her that partnering with the woman she was trying to destroy was in her best interest. "Miguel," I said, "that's either genius or insane, maybe both." "Sometimes there's not much difference," he replied with a grin. The initial contact came through industry intermediaries. Victoria Sterling agreed to a meeting, probably expecting to deliver some kind of ultimatum about my company's surrender. Instead, she found herself in my conference room, looking at a proposal that would fundamentally change the marketing industry in Chicago. Victoria Sterling was exactly what I'd expected: perfectly dressed, supremely confident, and radiating the kind of authority that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. She was also smart enough to recognize opportunity when it was presented properly. "Ms. Reynolds," she said, settling into her chair with practiced grace, "I have to admit, this isn't the meeting I was expecting. Most of my competitors usually call to discuss surrender terms by now." "Ms. Sterling," I replied, "I'm not most of your competitors, and I'm not here to surrender anything." I walked her through the merger proposal, explaining how combining Zenith's resources with Morrison & Associates' innovation could create a marketing powerhouse that would dominate the entire Midwest market. The numbers were compelling: projected revenue of $75 million within 2 years, cost savings of $8 million annually, and market share that would be virtually unassailable. "This is interesting," Victoria said after I finished the presentation. "But I'm curious about the leadership structure. You're proposing a co-CEO arrangement, but your company is significantly smaller than mine. Why should I agree to split control equally?" It was the question I'd been expecting, and I had an answer that I knew would appeal to her competitive instincts. "Because you need what I have more than I need what you have," I said bluntly. "You have resources, but I have innovation. You have market share, but I have client loyalty. You have a reputation for corporate efficiency, but I have a reputation for creative excellence. The merger only works if both sides bring their strongest assets to the table." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're very confident for someone who was working as a receptionist 2 years ago." Marketing coordinator, I corrected automatically. And confidence isn't about where you start. It's about where you end up. I ended up owning the company that once employed me. Where do you want to end up? The negotiation continued for 3 hours, with both sides making concessions and demands. Victoria wanted majority control of the merged entity. I insisted on equal partnership. She wanted to maintain Zenith's corporate culture. I demanded integration of Morrison & Associates' collaborative approach. She wanted to keep her existing management team. I required key positions for my people. In the end, we reached an agreement that satisfied both parties. The merged company would be called Sterling Reynolds Marketing, with Victoria as chairman and me as CEO. Zenith's resources would be combined with Morrison & Associates' innovation to create a marketing agency unlike anything the industry had seen before. The announcement of the merger sent shockwaves through the Chicago business community. Within hours, industry publications were running stories about the stunning alliance between two former competitors. The stock price of Zenith's parent company jumped 15% on the news. Most importantly, our combined client list represented nearly 40% of the major marketing contracts in the Midwest. But the real test of the merger came 3 months later, when Sterling Reynolds Marketing was invited to pitch for the biggest contract in the company's history. The Chicago Tourism Board was seeking an agency to manage their $50 million Discover Chicago campaign, a 3-year project that would showcase the city to international visitors and business travelers. The competition was fierce. Agencies from New York, Los Angeles, and London had submitted proposals. The final presentation would be made to a panel that included the mayor, the head of the tourism board, and representatives from major hotels and attractions throughout the city. I spent 2 weeks preparing for the presentation, working with a team that combined the best talent from both companies. Victoria Sterling's strategic planning expertise merged seamlessly with Miguel Rodriguez's creative insights. Sarah Martinez's financial modeling supported Jennifer Walsh's client relationship management. Even Bradley Morrison, who had been quietly rebuilding his reputation as a consultant, contributed valuable insights about the city's business community. The presentation took place in the Palmer House Hotel, in a ballroom that had once hosted presidents and celebrities. I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that represented the most powerful people in Chicago's business community, and felt a familiar surge of nervous energy. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, Chicago isn't just a city, it's a story. A story of innovation, resilience, and the kind of authentic American spirit that can't be manufactured or imitated. The Discover Chicago campaign isn't just about tourism. It's about sharing that story with the world. The next hour was a masterclass in collaborative presentation. I handled the strategic overview, Victoria managed the budget projections, Miguel showcased the creative concepts, and Sarah demonstrated the expected return on investment. Every member of the team contributed their expertise, creating a presentation that was both comprehensive and compelling. The creative centerpiece was a campaign called Chicago Built by Dreams. Instead of focusing on typical tourist attractions, we proposed highlighting the stories of real people who had built their dreams in Chicago. Entrepreneurs, artists, immigrants, and innovators who had found opportunity in the city's unique combination of Midwest values and big city ambition. This campaign doesn't just sell Chicago as a destination, I concluded. It sells Chicago as an inspiration, because in a world where so many places look the same, Chicago remains authentically itself. And that authenticity is our greatest marketing asset. The room erupted in applause when I finished, but the real validation came from Mayor Patricia Johnson, who stood up and said, "Ms. Reynolds, in 30 years of public service, I've never seen a presentation that captured the soul of our city so perfectly. Sterling Reynolds Marketing has our complete confidence." The contract award was announced the next morning. Sterling Reynolds Marketing had won the largest marketing contract in Chicago's history, beating out agencies with decades more experience and hundreds of millions in billings. The victory established our merged company as the undisputed leader in Midwest marketing, with a reputation that extended far beyond our regional boundaries. But the personal victory was even more meaningful. 2 years earlier, I'd been dismissed as a minimum wage loser with ideas above my station. Now I was the CEO of a company that employed 120 people, generated $45 million in annual revenue, and had just won the most prestigious contract in the city's history. The celebration party was held at the Union League Club, the same exclusive venue where Bradley Morrison had once entertained clients while his company crumbled around him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Bradley himself, who approached me during the cocktail hour with an expression of genuine gratitude. "Alice," he said, "I want you to know that working with you these past few months has been the most educational experience of my career. You've taught me things about leadership that I never learned in business school." I looked at him, seeing not the arrogant executive who had humiliated me, but a man who had genuinely learned from his mistakes. "Bradley, you always had the potential to be a good leader. You just needed someone to show you what that looked like." "I had that someone," he replied. "I just wasn't smart enough to listen." The evening continued with speeches, toasts, and the kind of networking that had once seemed impossible for a community college graduate from the wrong side of town. I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate me, partner with me, or simply understand how someone with my background had achieved so much success. As the party wound down, I stepped out onto the club's terrace, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had become the backdrop for the most unlikely success story in the city's business history. The lights of the downtown buildings stretched out like a constellation, each one representing dreams and ambitions, and the kind of possibilities that I'd once thought were reserved for other people. Sarah Martinez joined me on the terrace, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "So," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "what's next for the woman who went from minimum wage to CEO in 2 years?" I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The humiliation, the determination, the risks that had seemed impossible but had somehow paid off. The minimum wage loser had become not just a CEO, but the head of the most successful marketing agency in the Midwest. "Next," I said, raising my glass to meet hers, "we build something even bigger. Because this story isn't about what I accomplished. It's about what becomes possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations." The empire was built, but the real legacy was just beginning. 3 years after I'd walked into that conference room as the owner of Morrison & Associates, I found myself standing in the same spot, but everything had changed. The walls now displayed awards from the American Marketing Association, the Chicago Business Journal, and Forbes magazine. The conference table had been replaced with a custom-designed piece that could seat 30 people. Most importantly, the room was filled with faces I'd handpicked, brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds who shared my vision of what marketing could become. Sterling Reynolds Marketing had grown beyond my wildest dreams. We employed 300 people across offices in Chicago, Detroit, and Milwaukee. Our annual revenue had reached $120 million, making us the largest independent marketing agency in the Midwest. But the numbers, impressive as they were, weren't what mattered most. What mattered was the culture we'd created. A place where talent was recognized regardless of background, where innovation was valued over tradition, and where the best ideas could come from anyone, anywhere, in the organization. The quarterly all-hands meeting had become a tradition that I treasured. Unlike the mandatory gatherings of the Bradley Morrison era, these meetings were celebrations of collective achievement. Today's agenda included announcing our latest client win, recognizing outstanding employee contributions, and sharing the news I'd been keeping secret for weeks. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at faces that represented the most diverse and talented team I'd ever assembled. "I want to start today's meeting with a story. 3 years ago, I stood in this room and asked you to trust me. I was a minimum wage employee who just bought the company, and I had no MBA, no traditional credentials, and no safety net. What I had was a vision and the determination to make it real." The room was silent, but I could feel the energy. These people had been with me through the transformation, had witnessed firsthand what was possible when you refused to accept conventional limitations. Today I'm proud to announce that Sterling Reynolds Marketing has been selected as the exclusive marketing partner for the 2028 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. We beat out agencies from New York, London, and Tokyo to win the largest marketing contract in Olympic history. The eruption of applause was deafening. People stood, cheered, and embraced each other with the kind of genuine joy that comes from shared achievement. I watched their faces, remembering the skepticism and doubt that had greeted my first presentation to this company. Now, that same company was about to help showcase the world's greatest sporting event to a global audience of billions. But the Olympic contract wasn't just a business victory. It was validation of everything I'd fought for. The minimum wage loser, who'd been dismissed as unworthy of consideration, was now trusted with one of the most prestigious marketing campaigns in the world. After the meeting, I returned to my office to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Richard Morrison, Bradley's father and the founder of the original company, sat in one of my guest chairs. He was older than I'd expected, his hair completely gray and his face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from watching your life's work nearly destroyed. "Mr. Morrison," I said, genuinely surprised, "I didn't know you were coming." He stood and extended his hand. "Ms. Reynolds, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been following the company's progress and I felt it was time we met." I gestured for him to sit back down, studying his face for clues about his intentions. Richard Morrison was a legend in the marketing industry, but he was also Bradley's father. Our relationship was complicated by history and family loyalty. "I want to start by apologizing," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "Not just for Bradley's behavior, but for my own failure as a father. I built this company to be a legacy, but I failed to teach my son how to honor that legacy." The words hung in the air between us. I'd prepared for many conversations over the years, but this wasn't one of them. "Mr. Morrison," I said carefully, "your son is a good man who made mistakes. He's learned from them, and he's become a valuable contributor to our team." Richard nodded slowly. "I know. He's told me about the second chance you gave him, about how you helped him find his real strengths, instead of just punishing him for his weaknesses. That's not something many people would have done." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather portfolio. "I came here today to give you something that belongs to you now." He opened the portfolio to reveal the original incorporation documents for Morrison and Associates, signed in 1985. The papers were yellowed with age, but the signature was clear. Richard Morrison, founder and CEO. "When I started this company," he said, "I had a vision of what marketing could become. I wanted to create an agency that would help businesses tell their stories in ways that mattered. I wanted to build something that would make a difference." He paused, looking around my office at the awards and accolades that represented our achievements. "I thought that legacy died when Bradley nearly destroyed the company. But you've proven me wrong. You've taken my vision and made it bigger, better, and more meaningful than I ever imagined." I stared at the documents, understanding their significance. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were a symbolic passing of the torch from the company's founder to its current leader. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "I can't accept these. This company may be legally mine, but it will always be built on the foundation you created." He smiled for the first time since entering my office. "Ms. Reynolds, leadership isn't about ownership, it's about stewardship. You've proven that you understand that better than anyone. These documents belong with the person who truly embodies what this company was meant to be." The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard sharing stories about the early days of the company and his hopes for its future. When he finally left, I sat alone in my office, holding the incorporation documents and reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The intercom on my desk buzzed. "Ms. Reynolds," Nancy's voice came through, "you have a visitor. Someone named Marcus Thompson from Dynamo Corporation." I smiled, remembering the CEO who had given me my first major test as the owner of Morrison & Associates. "Send him in." Marcus entered with the same confident stride I remembered, but his expression was different. Instead of the cautious skepticism he'd shown 3 years earlier, his face showed genuine respect and admiration. "Alice," he said, dispensing with formalities, "I had to come see you personally. The Olympic contract announcement has the entire business community buzzing. Do you realize what you've accomplished?" I gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, too excited to be still. 3 years ago, I gave you a project that I thought might break you," he continued. "I was testing whether the minimum wage employee who'd bought her own company could handle the pressure of big league marketing. Instead, you delivered the most successful campaign in Dynamo's history." He pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, From Cubicle to Olympics, the Alice Reynolds story. You're not just a success story, Marcus said. You're an inspiration. Do you know how many people you've influenced? How many minimum wage workers are looking at your example and thinking, maybe I can do more than this? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on building the business that I hadn't fully considered the broader impact of my story. But Marcus was right. My journey from cubicle to CEO had resonated with people far beyond the marketing industry. Marcus, I said, I never set out to be an inspiration. I just wanted to prove that I belonged. And in proving that you belonged, he replied, you've shown everyone else that they might belong too. That's the real legacy of what you've built here. After Marcus left, I found myself thinking about legacy and influence in ways I'd never considered before. The minimum wage loser who'd been dismissed as unworthy had become not just a CEO, but a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations. The thought was interrupted by a knock on my door. Sarah Martinez entered, carrying a stack of documents and wearing the kind of expression that meant serious business. Alice, she said, I have something I need to discuss with you. It's about the future of the company. I gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. I've been analyzing our growth trajectory, and I think we're at a crossroads. We can continue growing organically, or we can make a move that would transform us into something completely different. She placed the documents on my desk. I've been approached by representatives from Omnicom Group. They want to acquire Sterling Reynolds Marketing for $400 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $400 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined. Enough to secure my financial future and the futures of everyone I cared about. But it was also the end of something I'd built from nothing. It's a generous offer, Sarah continued, but it comes with conditions. They want to maintain the Sterling Reynolds brand and keep you as CEO, but ultimate control would rest with Omnicom's board. You'd be running the company, but you wouldn't own it. I stared at the acquisition documents, my mind racing through the implications. Accepting the offer would mean financial security beyond my wildest dreams. Rejecting it would mean continuing to build something that was entirely mine, but with all the risks that entailed. Sarah, I said, what do you think I should do? She smiled, the expression of someone who'd known me long enough to predict my answer. I think you should do what you've always done. Follow your instincts and ignore everyone who tells you what's impossible. That evening, I stayed in the office long after everyone else had gone home. I walked through the empty halls, past the cubicles where talented people were building their careers, past the conference rooms where innovative campaigns were being born, past the break room where Miguel Rodriguez had first shared his insights about real marketing. I ended up in the same spot where my journey had begun, the cubicle I'd occupied for 3 years as a minimum wage employee. It was now occupied by Jessica Chen, a recent community college graduate who reminded me of myself at that age. Her desk was covered with marketing books, industry publications, and handwritten notes about campaign strategies. A post-it note stuck to her monitor caught my attention. Success isn't about where you start. It's about where you end up. It was a quote from an interview I'd given to Marketing Today magazine, but seeing it on Jessica's desk made it real in a way that magazine articles never could. I returned to my office and called Sarah. I've made my decision about the Omnicom offer. And? We're turning it down. Sterling Reynolds Marketing isn't for sale. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Sarah spoke. Alice, are you sure? $400 million is a life-changing amount of money. Sarah, I replied, my life has already changed. 3 years ago, I was a minimum wage employee who'd been dismissed as worthless. Today, I'm the CEO of a company that employs 300 people and is about to market the Olympics to the world. That transformation didn't happen because I took the safe path or accepted other people's limitations. It happened because I was willing to risk everything to build something better. So what's next? Sarah asked. I looked out my office window at the Chicago skyline, the same view that had inspired me during my darkest moments. Next, we build something even bigger. Because this story isn't about what I accomplished, it's about what becomes possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations. The next morning, I called a press conference to announce Sterling Reynolds Marketing's decision to remain independent. The business media was fascinated by the story of a CEO who'd turned down a $400 million acquisition offer to maintain control of her company. During the press conference, a reporter asked, "Ms. Reynolds, do you ever regret not taking the safer path? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just accepted your role as a minimum wage employee?" I smiled, remembering the frightened girl who'd sat in a conference room 3 years earlier, dismissed and humiliated by people who couldn't see her potential. "I spent 3 years accepting other people's definitions of what I was worth," I replied. "I'm not about to start again now." The minimum wage loser they laughed at has become the CEO they now respect. But more importantly, she's become the leader who shows others that transformation is possible. The press conference ended with the announcement that Sterling Reynolds Marketing would be establishing a scholarship fund for community college students pursuing careers in marketing. The Alice Reynolds Foundation would provide not just financial support, but mentorship and internship opportunities for young people who reminded me of myself. As I walked back to my office, I passed the conference room where it all began. Through the glass walls, I could see the new crop of junior employees presenting their ideas to the management team. Their faces showed the same mixture of nervousness and determination that I'd felt 3 years earlier. But unlike my experience, these young people were being heard. Their ideas were being evaluated on merit, not dismissed because of their background or credentials. They were being given the chance to prove themselves that I'd had to fight for. That afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice was familiar, but I hadn't heard it in over a year. "Alice, this is Bradley Morrison. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to share some news with you." "Of course, Bradley. What's going on?" "I've been accepted to the executive MBA program at Northwestern. I'm finally going to get the education I should have gotten the first time around. But more importantly, I wanted to thank you for showing me that leadership isn't about titles or credentials. It's about serving the people you're responsible for." I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought both of us to this moment. "Bradley, I'm proud of you. You've become the leader your father always hoped you could be." "I had a good teacher," he replied. "Someone who understands that people can change if they're given the chance." After the call ended, I sat in my office, surrounded by the symbols of success that had once seemed impossible. The awards on the wall, the Olympic contract on my desk, the view of the Chicago skyline that had witnessed my transformation from minimum wage employee to CEO. But the real symbols of success weren't in my office. They were in the lives of the people who'd been touched by my story. The employees who'd found opportunities they never thought possible. The young people who'd been inspired to pursue their dreams despite the obstacles. The community college students who would receive scholarships and mentorship through the foundation. The minimum wage loser who'd been dismissed as worthless had become not just a CEO, but a catalyst for change. She'd proven that success wasn't about where you started. It was about where you ended up. And she'd shown that sometimes, the people who are underestimated are the ones who end up changing everything. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took one last look at the conference room where my journey had begun. The same room where Bradley Morrison had called me a minimum wage loser. Where he'd dismissed my ideas as worthless. Where he'd made it clear that I would never be anything more than support staff. Now it was my conference room, in my company, and tomorrow it would be filled with talented people working on campaigns that would touch millions of lives. The transformation was complete, but the story was far from over. Because the real legacy of Alice Reynolds wasn't the company she'd built, or the contracts she'd won. It was the proof that transformation was possible, that potential existed in unexpected places, and that sometimes, the minimum wage loser becomes the leader who changes everything. The girl who'd been told she wasn't good enough had become the woman who redefined what good enough meant, and in doing so, she'd opened doors for everyone who came after her. The minimum wage loser had become the CEO, but more importantly, she'd become the inspiration for everyone who'd ever been told they weren't enough. The journey was complete. The legacy was just beginning. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.